Welcome to today's webinar titled Mapping Bit to Symbol Unpredictability in Convolutionally Encoded Messages with Checksums with Application to Galileo Open Service Navigation Message Authentication. This article was published in the summer 2022 issue of Navigation, the Journal of the Institute of Navigation. The full paper is available on Navigation's new open access web portal. You can read, download, cite, and share this article and many more at navi.ion.org. Today's webinar is being presented by the paper's authors, Dr. Curran O'Driscoll and Dr. Ignacio Fernandez Hernandez. Curran O'Driscoll received his PhD degree from the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering, University College Cork in Ireland. He was a senior research engineer with the Plan Group at the Department of Geomatics Engineering in the University of Calgary from 2007 to 2010, and with the European Commission from 2011 to 2013, first at the JRC and later with the European GNSS Programs Directorate in Brussels. From January 2014 to 2017, Dr. O'Driscoll was a research fellow at University College Cork. He now works as an independent consultant, specializing in all areas of GNSS signal processing. Ignacio Fernandez Hernandez received his PhD degree in electronic systems from Aalborg University. He has led the design and development of Galileo high accuracy and authentication services over the last years and is a visiting professor at KU Leuven, where he teaches a graduate course on GNSS. He is the latest recipient of ION's prestigious Thurlow Award. Following today's presentation, we'll take questions. To ask a question, you can click on the Q&A box in your Zoom viewer. As stated, you can download this paper and many more at navi.ion.org. A recording of this webinar will also be posted to our website. So thank you for being here, and now we'll turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you for that, Rick. My name is Curran O'Driscoll. Thanks for that kind introduction. I do apologize for the length of the title, which is a bit of a mouthful: Mapping Bit to Symbol Unpredictability in Convolutionally Encoded Messages with Checksums with Application to Galileo OSNMA. This was some work that I did with Ignacio a few years ago on a contract, and I will hand over to him now for the motivation for this work.
Thank you very much, Kilian, and thanks also to the Institute of Navigation for giving us this opportunity to present our work, in this case, mainly Kilian's work. So I will introduce the content of the paper by presenting the motivation section. So what we want to do with this work is to maximize the value that users can extract out of GNSS authentication. GNSS authentication has been a major motivation for the SatNav community in the last decade. I think we are all aware of that. But what means GNSS authentication, or what means authenticating GNSS? GNSS main utility is the position on 3 dimensions time, as everyone knows. So authenticating GNSS requires that all elements that are used in computing the 3-dimensional position and time are authentic. So these elements are divided in 2 categories: the data that we use to calculate our position and the pseudo-range measurements. Regarding the data, this consists of the satellite health, that tells us if we can use the satellite or not, the ephemerides telling us where the satellite is in its orbit and its clock offset, the GNSS time counter, the ionospheric model, if we use it in correcting our pseudo-range, for example, in the case of ClockWizard for GPS or NECWIC-G for Galileo. And all this is already authenticated with, or can be already authenticated with the so-called NMA, Navigation Message Authentication. As you know, probably, and we will say later in this paper, there is already an NMA implemented in Galileo, known as OS, Open Service NMA, and this is going to be the basis of this work. So this, let's say, problem is solved, at least in theory, and then we have the other component, which is the trickiest to authenticate, which is the pseudo ranges. Next slide, please. So how can we authenticate pseudo ranges? We are providing here a very simple formulation of what a pseudo range is, which is the difference in time between the reception time in the receiver, T sub Rx, and the transmission time in the satellite. We call it pseudo range because it includes not only the geometric range, but also the bias in the receiver with respect to genesis time, and also some errors. So if we want to authenticate the pseudo range, we could say that if we authenticate these two terms, our pseudo range can be authenticated. In order to authenticate the reception time, we have to ensure that the receiver is not tampered with. This is our assumption here, because otherwise the position and time that the receiver is providing could be also spoofed. So we assume that, that this is not the case. And then the remaining term is the transmission time. So we have to ensure that, that in order to ensure the authentication of this term, that the signal that we are tracking in our receiver departed from the satellite and not from any other source, and it has not been artificially delayed or advanced. We all know that there are some natural sources of error in the pseudo range, like the ionosphere, the troposphere, but we are not talking about that. We are talking about artificially delaying or advancing the signal. Let's divide these two possible attacks in these two categories, advanced and replace or delays. Can the signal be advanced? If the signal is predictable, yes, it can be advanced. There is nothing preventing an adversary to advance the signal. What if the signal is unpredictable? If the signal is unpredictable, this is more difficult, but the signal can be still vulnerable to advances. And in particular, if the signal bit stream is encoded, as it is the case in the Galileo I with a forward error correction scheme, then an attacker could predict part of the message when another part has been already disclosed, and therefore could advance the signal, even if it is partly unpredictable at bit level. And we will look at that later. But in order to protect against this attack, we need to know exactly what are the parts of the signal that are unpredictable and what are the parts that are predictable. This is absolutely necessary. And then moving to the second category, can the signal be replayed? The short answer is yes, the signal can be replayed, but we can add features to the signal to make this difficult. Ideally, these features can be added at the spreading code level in the component of the signal, which is the spreading code, because the signal before correlation with this spreading code is below the noise, the thermal noise. So therefore, it is, let's say, more difficult for an attacker to delay the signal if we apply measures at the spreading code. And this is what we are trying to do in Galileo with the ACAS service, hopefully available in the next years, and also in GPS with Chimera. In the meantime, before we have spreading code authentication features in our open signals, and with a lot of caution or some caution, we believe that NMA unpredictability can contribute to detect replay attacks. But in order to do that, we need to also know what are the unpredictable parts of the message, which is also the focus of this paper. Next slide, please. So we are focusing on NMA because it is being introduced in GNSS, and in particular, we are focusing on Galileo OSNMA, Open Service Navigation Message Authentication, because it provides bit and symbol unpredictability, and because it has been broadcast in a stable way, openly and worldwide for the last months. I mean, we're getting closer to 1 year. You can see on the right the availability of OSNMA transmitting satellites above certain elevations. We have to highlight that you don't need 4 satellites to have OSNMA PVT, because some satellites can cross-authenticate, as we call it, other satellites. And therefore, we have a good source of information that we can use to evaluate bit and symbol unpredictability. So our focus is on OSNMA. Next slide, please. So how can NMA and OSNMA contribute to mitigating signal advances and replays? Regarding signal or advanced signals, this has been reported as the FEA attack, and this will be described later by Kilian in more detail. And regarding the detection of replayed signals with NMA, this is not part of this work, but I wanted to highlight it as it is part of the context that makes this work relevant. NMA can protect against zero delay attacks, so attacks where an attacker is synchronizing the signal with a zero delay with the authentic signal. But in order to do that, the receiver needs to look at the unpredictable symbols and do some detailed and refined signal processing of these symbols compared to the rest. So therefore, no matter that we want to protect against advanced signals or replayed signals, the receiver needs to know which symbols in the message stream are unpredictable. This is not obvious due mainly to the forward error correction and also the CRC computation, and it is the main motivation of this work. As I said before, this is particularized for the OSNMA message, in particular the OSNMA message definition that we had at the time that this work was started a couple of years ago. Now it has been slightly changed, but the principles are still applicable. And it is also, or it can be also extrapolated to other message definitions, as it will be the case for GPS schemera and maybe other NMA schemes in other GNSS. On the right, you can see some results that we obtained using NMA to protect against replay attacks that show that in many conditions with some patience and some seconds of monitoring in detail the unpredictable symbols, a receiver can have a decent capability of or probability of detection of a zero delay attack. You can consult the details in the paper that is referred in the bottom right. And now I will hand over to Kilian, who will present the rest of the paper, which is the main contribution of the work. So, Kilian.
Thank you, Ignacio. Yes, I will present now the details from the paper, given that context that Ignacio has just given us. So the idea with navigation message authentication is that we're adding extra data bits to the navigation message, as Ignacio described. And these are effectively digital signatures that authenticate the message, the data message that's transmitted by the satellite. And what's important from our point of view is that by definition, at least some of these bits that are added, these NMA bits, are unknown a priori to a receiver and also hence to an attacker. So even if the attacker knows the entirety of the authentic message, they do not a priori know the bits of the navigation message authentication. Now we're going to focus on Galileo. I'm hoping to bring up the laser pointer here. Okay, so this is the Galileo E1 OS signal, which is transmitted in pages. We have 1 second pages. This is an even page and an odd page. And the Galileo NMA data is transmitted entirely in this odd page of 40 bits. This is where the OSNMA bits are contained. Now, it's useful for us, as Ignacio was describing, to understand that some of these bits are unknown a priori, and can we use that information to detect a type of attack? So we can assume that the message has some bits that we can assume are known by an attacker and some bits which are unknown. And that's quite straightforward based on what we saw on the previous slide. However, the issue is that the satellite doesn't transmit these bits directly. It doesn't transmit these raw navigation bits, navigation message bits. They're first encoded using a forward error correction scheme or a FEC scheme. And the purpose of this forward error correction is to add redundancy to the message. And how we're going to look at this is that the data bits come in and the FEC scheme creates symbols at the output. So we're going to refer regularly now to bits, which are the raw navigation data, and symbols, which are the output from this forward error correction and what is finally actually broadcast by the satellite. So the symbols are what are received by the receiver and also what are received by the attacker. And the concept of forward error correction is that we can receive the symbol stream, receiving some symbols in error, and the redundancy in those symbols allows us to reliably extract the raw navigation data that was actually transmitted. Excuse me. So if we look at Galileo, in particular Galileo OS, we're going to look at the forward error correction scheme. And in fact, we're going to consider 3 different layers here. First, I'm going to talk about this convolutional code layer. After that, we will have an interleaver. And I'm also going to talk about the cyclic redundancy check. And these are 3 layers that are used in this forward error correction. So the convolutional code for Galileo for the INAV is a rate-half convolutional encoder. And the encoder is illustrated down here on the bottom left. So each output symbol, which is on the right here, is a function of the input. And these are delays, essentially flip-flops. So we have the 7 previous data bits all contribute to 2 output symbols. The idea with this encoder is that it operates on the pages themselves. So there's no interdependency between the odd and the even page. We encode the odd page, we encode the even page, and there's no flow of information back and forth between the 2. Each page has 120 bits. So we have a stream of 120 bits coming in here. And these create 240 symbols at the output using this approach. From a mathematical point of view, we can show that this can be modeled as an affine transform. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take our input data. This is our 120 bits of input data. It's a vector 120 bits long, zeros and ones. It's encoded by this encoding matrix, which is written down here, which is simply a representation of these two equations that are used to generate the two symbols. And then there's also the addition of this constant term C, and it's this constant term that makes it an affine transform rather than a direct linear transform. And this C simply captures the impact of this inverter and the second output. So effectively, the output of this matrix multiplication is the output here. And then adding this term effectively negates the G2 output here, or every second output. So this is our model of what the convolutional code does. The next stage in this forward error correction is the interleaver. And so we have remember, we have 120 bits going into the convolutional code. We get 240 symbols out. These 240 symbols are then loaded into a matrix. They're loaded in column-wise. So we can see we get symbol 1, symbol 2, symbol 3, and so on, 9, 10, 11, until we fill up this matrix. That's when it's generated. When it's broadcast, then the outputs are broadcast along the rows. So we transmit symbol 1, then symbol 9, symbol 17, and so on. And this serves so that if we have a burst of errors, when we de-interleave, the effect of that burst is spread throughout our page. What's interesting about this is that this interleaver can also be modeled mathematically as a matrix multiplication. So we have our 120 bits that are multiplied by a matrix to create our 240 symbols. We add the constant term that we saw on the previous slide. We take the result from that, and we can multiply that by effectively a permutation matrix, which gives us our interleaver. The third component of the forward error correction is actually the first one applied, but I've left it to the end because we're going to treat this a little bit differently or we do in the paper. And this is the cyclic redundancy check, or CRC. And the CRC is actually an error detection rather than error correction mechanism, and it's built into the navigation data itself. So that means that those 120 bits that we're putting into the convolutional encoder, the CRC has already been applied at that point. So we do CRC first, then convolutional encoder, then interleaver. Now in the INAV, what's interesting is that the message that's used to compute the CRC actually contains elements from both the even and the odd pages. So whereas the convolutional encoder keeps an odd page separate from an even page, the CRC does some intercommingling of data. So the message itself, this message here, is viewed as a polynomial over GF2, where each element of the polynomial is 1 bit of your data. And the computation of so this message, as I said, comes from a combination of the even and the odd pages. And then the actual CRC itself is computed as mathematically as a remainder after polynomial division by this generator polynomial. So it sounds quite involved, but it's actually quite easy to implement in code. So with the INAV CRC computation, I think it's easy. It can be nice to visualize this. So this is what we saw a few minutes ago for the Galileo INAV message. We have an odd page and an even page. And in fact, the CRC is computed by taking some of the even page bits, some of the odd page bits, and creating a message and computing the CRC from that. Now, why that's important from our point of view is because, remember, these reserved 1 bits, these are the OSNMA bits. These are unknown. We don't know these in advance. But these unknown bits go into our CRC computation message. And that means that our CRC bits are also unknown in advance. And those CRC bits are also broadcast in the odd page. So when we look at the data, this is before we do any of the convolutional encoding or the interleaver, we already have here 64 bits that are potentially at least unknown. I'm going to make a little note here on the terminology that I use in the following, because we have some slightly different concepts, and it's important to try and clarify these in our minds. So I'm going to talk about 2 different situations. The first is before any information is transmitted by a satellite. So a priori, before anything has been transmitted by the satellite, we're going to assume that the attacker knows some bits. These are known bits. And there are other bits that the attacker does not know. So we refer to these as the unknown bits. Those known bits and unknown bits are processed through CRC and convolutional encoding and the interleaver to produce symbols. And some of those symbols are going to be known a priori, and some of them are going to be unknown. So this is our situation before anything is broadcast. What happens then is that we start to receive symbols from the satellite, both the victim receiver or our receiver, and also the attacker. They receive these symbols from the satellite, and what the attacker is going to try to do is predict future symbols based on the a priori known information and also the new information they get from this, the symbols from the satellite. So we're going to assume for the moment that the attacker has received, for example, symbols 1 to n. And now they wish to predict symbol n plus k. So they're doing a prediction k symbols in advance. So they're essentially attempting to advance time by k symbols. And this goes back to one of the attack modes that Ignacio was referring to in the motivation. So what we're going to say is that a priori, we don't know these symbols, let's say. But having received some symbols from the satellite, some of those symbols now become predictable. So we call a symbol k predictable if, having received n symbols, we can predict the symbol k symbols in advance. Our usual case of interest is actually just one symbol in advance, where the attacker is hoping to do an advance of just one symbol. And we'll usually refer to these as predictable symbols, or those symbols that the attacker can know at least one symbol prior to the time that they receive the symbol itself. So just to clarify a little bit, the difference between unknown and unpredictable is unknown is our state of information prior to anything being broadcast from the satellite. And then the predictability is how we can use this information received from the satellite to predict future symbols that were previously unknown. Okay, on with the show. So our question now is for OSNMA, let's start at the very top. Which bits are unknown? Now, this is the analysis in the paper, as Ignacio kind of presaged in the motivation. We took some information here from configurations that are no longer really used in the broadcast OSNMA, but the principle still applies. However, this structure is still the same. The OSNMA bits themselves, remember, we have 40 bits every odd page, and these are divided into two kind of sub messages. One is the header k root section of 8 bits, and the other is the MAC k section. This consists of message authentication codes, or MACs, and keys, which is where the k comes from here. And those are 32 bits every 2 seconds. Now, the concept here is that the HK root is actually information that's shared amongst the satellites. So we're going to take a pessimistic view and assume that when we're looking at one particular signal, that maybe the attacker has already received this HK root information from somewhere else. So we're going to take a very pessimistic view and assume that that is already known to the attacker. Within the MAC k section, then, we have essentially 3 different types of information. We have the message authentication codes themselves. These are the digital signatures that I was talking about, although we want to be careful with terminology, but these sign the data. And we're going to assume that these are unknown. In fact, that's our fundamental premise. The attacker, nobody knows these until it's broadcast. There's also what I would call MAC-related information, or effectively kind of metadata that may repeat regularly. So again, pessimistically, we will assume that this is known. And the third component of the information in these MAC k sections is the key itself, the Tesla key in this case. Now, again, you might think that we should consider this to be unknown, but in fact, this key information is shared amongst the satellites. So again, pessimistically, we're going to assume that the attacker already knows the key. Again, it's a pessimistic view. So we're taking the worst case assumption from the defender's point of view. So from our point of view, of these bits, only those bits related to message authentication codes we're going to assume are unknown. We are then also going to assume that the CRC field is unknown. And we do this based on the logic that I showed a few minutes ago in the animation, because the CRC is in fact dependent on all 40 of these bits. So let's take an example configuration. This is a configuration, again, that's not really being used at the moment, but again, it's just to give an idea. So in this very rough diagram, we have a subframe that's being transmitted by the satellites. In this case, we have 15 of the odd pages. This is the first, second, third, and so on, up to the 15th odd page in one subframe. And what we're showing here is the distribution of the 32 MAC k bits within the odd page of each of those odd pages, rather. And the reason I want to show this is that it gives us the viewpoint, the overview of how the unknown bits are distributed in our message. So if you recall, anything that's a MAC is assumed to be unknown, and basically everything else is assumed to be known. So from this, we can identify 4 different page types. If you recall, we assume the keys are known. So for example, page 6 and page 7 here only contain key information. Therefore, those 2 pages we're going to assume are perfectly known. We also have pages that contain, for example, page 1 here contains only a MAC. So in this case, all of those bits are assumed to be unknown. So these are 2 different possibilities. The remaining 2 possibilities are given by examples here of page 2 and page 3. where we have this MAC sequence information, which we're going to assume is broadcast regularly, so we know what it is in advance. And this half of the next MAC is here as well. So here we have 16 bits that we assume to be are known and 16 bits that we assume are unknown. And page 3 then is exactly the other way around. We have 16 unknown bits followed by 16 known bits. So this is simply how we would extract this information from the configuration. We've done this particular configuration, but any configuration, the same methodology would apply. We would have different page types, and we would need to determine, given a page type with 32 unknown bits, how can we compute which symbols are unpredictable? That's the goal of this work. So given those page types, we look now at page 1, page 2, and page 3, which are the 3 page types that we have identified in that configuration that have unknown bits. And what we do is we simply pass those unknown bits through our whole process of CRC, convolutional encoding, and interleaver. And what we're looking at here is essentially the interleaver matrix, right? So this is for that one page, all 240 symbols as they would appear in the interleaver matrix. So this is for the 32 unknown bits, and we can see all these green symbols are those symbols that are unknown. And remember, that means these are symbols that nobody knows before they receive anything from the satellites. Similarly, we have page 2 here, where the last 16 bits of the MAC are unknown. We get a different distribution. And for page 3, again, we have a slightly different distribution. So this is just 3 different cases. And what's interesting here is that we can very clearly see the contribution of NMA bits to the unknown symbols and the contribution of CRC bits to the unknown symbols. There's a kind of a separation between those. And that makes sense from the diagram we saw before, where we saw we've got 40 OSNMA symbols over here and 24 CRC symbols over there. And this is how those symbols propagate through the, and this is the uncertainty. This is how the uncertainty from the NMA bits propagates into the CRC by the mechanism of this polynomial remainder division that we compute, and then spreading out through the symbols via the convolutional encoding and the interleaver. So to talk a little bit about this forward estimation attack, because this again motivates why it is we want to go from those unknown symbols to the unpredictable symbols. So this was an attack that was introduced in this paper from 2016. And the idea here was to use the extra redundancy introduced by the forward error correction to generate a spoofed navigation message with an advance of, say, K symbols. In this case, for this attack, the predicted symbols were either derived by directly inverting the decoder or using a modified Viterbi encoder. And again, there's details in that paper below. Furthermore, in the attack, the symbols that we were unsure about are de-weighted to kind of further potentially fool a soft decision Viterbi decoder. And we can see that the successful attacks were the success rate was quite high, particularly for low weightings of the unknown symbols or the unpredictable symbols. But it's also important to note that for this attack, a successful attack means that the defender has decoded the true navigation message. So in other words, even though this is an attack against a navigation message authentication, it doesn't actually break the authentication of the navigation message. In order to fool the receiver, you still have to convince them to decode the true navigation message. The difficulty is that we can maybe get an advance, so they're getting the right data, but we're actually manipulating the pseudorange. Okay. So really the concept here is that we would like to defend against this type of forward estimation attack. And the goal is, let's say that we decode the data and the authentication checks pass. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take the data that we've just decoded, re-encode it back through our convolutional encoder, compute the CRC, convolutional encoder, and interleaver. Take those symbols that we've computed and then compare those symbols with the symbols that we actually received. And what we should see is those symbols that are unpredictable should have higher symbol error rates. In other words, the mismatch between our re-encoded symbols and the raw symbols that we received should be higher for those unpredictable symbols. And what we would like is that we would have a defense against this where we can basically use this unpredictability of the symbols to detect this forward estimation attack. But the first key step here is to correctly identify which symbols are unpredictable. And that is the work that we are doing here. So what we've done is develop this mathematical model. And we did it in 2 steps. First of all, to make it more tractable, our first stage was said, let's just ignore the CRC. The CRC is a complicating factor. It's this polynomial division with remainder, whereas everything else is kind of matrix multiplications and linear transforms is quite straightforward. So the approach that we took is to take our message D, so this is again this vector of 120 bits for one page, and we say, okay, let's split that into 2 components, D sub K and D sub U. These are both vectors that are 120 bits long, but D sub K has zeros in all the locations where we don't know what the bits are, and has the true values in the locations where we do know what the bits are. And then the unknown bits are zeros in the locations where we do know what the bits are, and then should take on the final values once we find out what they are in the locations where we don't know the bits. So this allows us to sort of separate out the data bits into the combination of D sub k and D sub u. And then when we look at the combination of the convolutional encoder and the interleaver, we can write that down very simply as an equation like this. And so we can say that the symbols that we generate are this is the interleaving matrix, the interleaver, and this is the affine transform that we saw for the convolutional encoder. And we see that these symbols are given as the sum of known symbols, which is this component here, and unknown symbols, which is this component over here. So our unknown symbols can be expressed as just a matrix multiplication times our unknown bits. And this is a system of equations. We have effectively a certain number of unknown bits, a certain number of unknowns on one side, and a certain number of equations that we need to solve. And so the next stage that we have is we make this observation that as we receive a symbol, as we receive one of these unknown symbols in particular from the satellite, essentially this unknown symbol gives us one extra line or one extra row of our matrix, one extra equation in our system of linear equations. And that system of linear equations becomes solvable once that matrix becomes full rank. Okay, so the idea is that as we add each new equation, we add one more row to the matrix. And what we do is we compute the rank of that matrix. And every time we get a new symbol, we compute the rank of the matrix. And if the rank does not increase, then that means that there was no new information from that symbol. Okay, so that all the information that we got from that symbol was already present in the matrix that we already have. In other words, was already present in the symbols that we've already received. And what that tells us is that this symbol was predictable. We knew that symbol in advance. We could have worked out what that symbol was. So now we have an algorithm for determining which symbols are predictable and which are unpredictable. And what's nice about this is that to compute the rank of the matrix, we don't actually need to receive the symbols. We just need to say, okay, we're going to get this symbol and then this symbol and then this symbol. And we know exactly the matrix of equations that we have. And therefore we can compute the rank and store it offline. We don't need to do this online. And once we know where the unknown symbols are, which means knowing where the unknown bits are, then we can compute the unpredictable symbols and the predictable symbols in advance and simply store that to one side. So here's an example now. Remember, this is our initial methodology where we're ignoring the CRC. So this is again the 32, the location where we have 32 MAC bits are unknown. And these green and yellow are the initially unknown symbols, the a priori unknown symbols. And we're ignoring the CRC, so we don't see any CRC symbols over here. And what we're showing this time in green is those symbols that our algorithm has computed as being unpredictable. So when we receive this symbol, there's no way we could have predicted this in advance. Similarly, the next symbol we receive is this one. There's no way we could have got that, and so on. We keep receiving symbols until we get to this point. When we receive this symbol, what this algorithm has told us is that we now have sufficient information to predict the next symbol. So this symbol here is actually predictable. And similarly, here, this symbol is predictable. And once we've received this symbol, we now have received 32 unpredictable symbols, and now all the rest of the symbols become predictable. We know them. We can compute them without error. What's interesting about this with this approach is that a previous paper that was published looking at the predictability of these symbols basically made the simplifying assumption that the first 32 symbols are unpredictable. But what we're able to show here with this approach is, in fact, these two symbols are predictable. And while it's not a huge difference, this could have an impact on could bias our forward estimation attack detector. So I think it's important to correctly identify which symbols are unpredictable. The problem with this, of course, is that it completely ignores the CRC. So the next stage was, well, I thought was going to be much more challenging because we need to now account for the CRC, which we remember is computed as a remainder after polynomial division over the Galois field GF2 of the CRC message by a generator polynomial. Now, when I started looking at this, I came across a result that I thought was quite interesting, probably very well known, but was a bit of a surprise to me. And that is that the CRC, this relationship is in fact a linear relationship. So the message M, that is the input to the CRC computation, can be simply multiplied by a CRC and equivalently multiplied by this matrix over GF2 to give us the CRC bits. So these would be our 24 CRC bits. And this is a 24 by n, where n is the length of the message matrix. So what's nice about this is that with a little bit of extra work, we can incorporate this directly into the approach that we've already done, because our existing approach is based on this linear mapping from bits to symbols, in particular from unknown bits to unknown symbols. And this means that we can very well, with a little bit of work, we can adapt it. Now, the details are in the paper. I don't get to it here because it's a little bit involved. But effectively, we can compute this matrix, which I think is quite nice, just based on using the long division algorithm. So, we all learned this in primary school. It's a slight modification of the algorithm operating over the binary field, but it works very, very nicely. And again, we can compute this in advance. So once we kind of modify our approach, we now end up with a scenario like this. So in this case, again, we can see that we have a combination over here of unknown symbols. So again, green and yellow are unknown, green for unpredictable, yellow for predictable. And again, we can see in this case, for the case of 32 MAC bits that are unknown and an advance of one symbol, we have both the NMA unknown symbols and the CRC unknown symbols. And our technique allows us then to say that, okay, these 32 symbols identified in green, those are the symbols that are unpredictable. No matter what the attacker does, they have no better than a 50% chance of getting those symbols correct when they estimate them. And that's nice because this allows us to incorporate the CRC bit. So this result is quite different to this one, obviously. But this is the truth. This is what we really want to focus on when we're trying to detect a forward estimation attack. Okay, the other thing that we can do, and I just want to show this, again, these are two configurations that were under consideration 2 years ago when the work was initially done, where we have 96 bits for the key, 32 bits for the MAC, and in this case, two MAC key sections per subframe, and in this case, one MAC key section for subframe. And the idea behind this, what we want to show is that we can take our interleaver matrix that we had before and just sort of unroll it. So we have 240 symbols along here. Again, the green symbols are our unpredictable symbols. And then this is over an entire subframe. And so this is our mask, effectively. We can just store this. If we know this configuration, we can compute this and store it. So within the receiver, we can just pull this up. We don't have to do an awful lot of computation. And this is a very simple bit mask that can be used to identify the unpredictable symbols. Now, this would need to be redone for the current configurations or for any future configuration, but that is not that difficult. So what we want to do then is, okay, we've identified which symbols we think are unpredictable. So how are we going to test this? Well, the way to test this is to actually simulate a simple forward estimation attack, run the attack, generate the spoofed symbols, and then run those spoofed symbols through a Viterbi decoder to try and decode the navigation message. And once we've decoded that navigation message, we re-encode the results to obtain the symbols, and then look at the symbol error rates and compare where the symbol error rates are roughly 50% versus where they're 0, versus against where we predicted the results to be like that. So here we're going to show, again, quite a lot of results, but the idea here is that this is for the page 1, which is again the 32 unknown MAC bits. And our prediction over here is these are the diagrams that I showed you before, but this time with an advance of 1, an advance of 4, and an advance of 8. So these are the symbols that are unpredictable under those conditions. And on the right, this is the result, the symbol error rate, again arranged in kind of the interleaver grid to make it easier to visualize. And what we see is that the dark blue is essentially a symbol error rate of 0, and the kind of the orangey yellow is a symbol error rate of approximately 50%. And so you can see that the patterns that we've identified, you can really identify them here, and also over here, that the symbols that we have identified as being unpredictable do indeed turn out to be those symbols that the attack cannot predict. So it's very important to emphasize that the attack in this case is not trying to establish which symbols are predictable and which are not. It is simply working off the information that it has and trying to re-encode it as quickly and efficiently as possible. And despite that, we still end up in the situation where these symbols that we have identified as unpredictable essentially have a 50% error rate. And so this can form the basis of a defense against this type of attack. The other thing to note that I want to show briefly is that the minimum subset that you need to check are the subset identified for an advance of 1 symbol. These symbols remain unpredictable when we go to an advance of 4, 8, or further. But what happens when we advance more is that more symbols also become unpredictable. For example, this symbol became unpredictable here, as did this one and that one. So in other words, the defense, what I would do is really look at these symbols that we have identified as unpredictable for an advance of 1 symbol. This is for page 2. So this is again where the second 16 bits of the OSNMA of the MAC are unpredictable. And again, we see that we have a match in where the unpredictable symbols occur and where the forward estimation attack essentially has a 50% symbol error rate. And finally, again, the same thing for the page type 3. Okay. Just briefly, we also looked at the bit error rates, and we saw that we had, so a bit error rate means that when we decoded the data from the, through our Viterbi decoder, so the spoofed data, we decoded that, sometimes we had bit error rates. And in fact, what we find for these pages with 32 unknown bits, we had quite high bit error rates of, up to 40 to 80% of our, meaning that we would not be able to decode that data effectively. It's also interesting to note that the fewer bits that are unpredictable or unknown, excuse me, in the NMA stream, the easier it is for the spoofer to spoof us. So it's obviously in our interest to have as many unpredictable or unknown bits as possible in the MAC sections. And the other thing that I thought was interesting to look at is to say, let's take those bit error rates and see where they occur. And obviously what we see is that, again, for page type 1, where we have 32 unknown bits, these are our INAV bits. Remember, there's 120 of those. And if you remember back to our diagram, these are the OSNMA bits, the 40 OSNMA bits, and the 24 CRC bits. And this is where we have our bit error rates. And that makes sense because these are the bits that are unknown a priori to the attacker. Okay. So in conclusion, in this paper, we've developed a method to determine the mapping from unknown bits to unpredictable symbols for Galileo OSNMA. The method is based on identifying the relationship between symbols and bits as a system of linear equations, identifying the rank of this system of equations as each new equation is added, as each new symbol is received. Once we can determine these unpredictable symbols, then we can re-encode the data that we've decoded, the navigation message. And then what the next stage really is to define test statistics based on the reception of the symbols and the comparison between the predictable and unpredictable symbol error rates. We've shown that this is effective against a simulated forward estimation attack. But one thing that Ignacio mentioned, I think it's important to emphasize, is that the approach is very general and can quite easily be extended to other NMA schemes, whether that's Chimera or whether that's something like SBAS authentication, if something like that is going to happen. And yeah, I think that the next stage really with this is to incorporate some of the work that Ignacio was showing from, that he's done with other parties, to use their defense mechanisms in conjunction with this unpredictability identifier. Okay, so again, the full paper, I say fall, apparently it's the summer 2022 edition, so I apologize for that. But it's available on the website. If you're interested, please go and read, and you can contact me for any questions that you have. Thank you. I think I just see a question came in there.
It says, could you combine INAV and FNAV to improve detection?
Not really, because we're very much relying on the unpredictable bits, and there's no OSNMA in the FNAV message. We could use, let me see, can we? I don't think so, not off the top of my head. How would it change it? Sorry, there's another question just come in there. How would it change the key to unpredictable change the results? That's a good question, actually. So we've taken a pessimistic view. So my view on this is with an unpredictable key, we would have a much better ability. We'd have more unpredictable symbols, effectively, many more unpredictable symbols, which would lead to an improved ability to detect an attack. And in fact, the approach that we've taken is to treat the key as predictable. You could work on that a little bit, relax that a little bit by considering the key from the first satellite you get it from to be unpredictable, but you need to be careful around the assumptions you make with that.
There's also, if you click on the chat, there's a question there about the unpredictable symbols are only available in odd pages, 1, 3, 5, and so on. Mm-hmm. The question says, why are there unpredictable symbols in page 2 and so on? Maybe it's supposed to say, why are there not?
No. That's a good question. That's actually really down to my mislabeling of what's a page. So when I say page 2, I mean the page pair. And I really should have clarified this. So we have, if we go back to the slide that I think you're probably referring to, which is a little bit further back here. So what we can see here is I say page. This is probably bad nomenclature. These are 15 of these page pairs effectively. So this is the first odd page, the second odd page, the third odd page, and so on in this subframe. So there are, in fact, according to our model, no unpredictable symbols in page 2 or the even pages. Okay, no problem. There's another question over in the Q&A, I think. Yes. Will you look into OSNMA new public key messages and how they will affect attacks? Again, so these new public key messages are transmitted through the HK root section. And again, we've made the conservative assumption that every HK root that you've received, somebody has potentially already received it because of this potential for distribution amongst the satellites. So again, if you needed more symbols, you might be able to try to use this HK root, but you're taking extra risk with that. So the next question is, if an attacker combines a scare attack, will this be detectable? So a scare attack, I would say this forward estimation attack is quite different to a scare attack. And I would rely on traditional scare attack detection techniques for a scare attack and something like this for a forward estimation attack. And then really that's the motivation for this, because the concept with the forward estimation attack as originally published was, this is something that will have will not be detectable at all by means that you would use to detect a scare attack. Because you're not doing that sort of manipulation as you would in scare. You're transmitting the symbols as they are. So what I would say is that you would still need all the tools in your tool belt to detect a scare type of attack, which is a little bit different, doesn't do the same kind of one symbol advance that we have for the forward estimation attack.
If I may complement this, well, thank you very much, Killian, again for the presentation and also for answering the questions and loading me from having to answer. Yeah, on the scare attack, I totally agree. It's a totally different type of attack, but nevertheless, it is, let's say, it is an attack that, in theory, and under some conditions, if you are tracking an authentic signal, might be detected by looking at let's say, the unpredictability of the signal. So as the signal is a combination of the code and the spreading code and the symbols, there are some parts of the signal that are unpredictable, at least for a while, until a receiver, maybe in some microseconds, but still, or the attacker have estimated what is the symbol. So a receiver could well look at these parts of the signal, and if it, under the assumption that the starting point is the receiver is tracking an authentic signal, it can detect some anomalies in these, let's say, these parts of the signal that are unpredictable, which coincide with the beginning of the unpredictable symbols, and try to get some statistics on that. So this was part of why I added some slides in the motivation, because the work presented by Killian was mostly focused on the FEA attack, which is a different one, but nevertheless, knowing where are the unpredictable symbols has other applications as this one. That being said, we don't want to, let's say, encourage the receiver community to use OSNMA for anti-replay. There are some, risks of that. So anti-replay should be better protected with spreading code authentication, which we cannot do yet. Nevertheless, if you want further reference for this, there is the paper from Gonzalo Seco, whom I see in the audience, by the way, and other people, me included, on looking at the unpredictable symbols to protect against zero delay or scare attacks. So you can find more information there. And yeah, I just wanted to say that if there are receiver engineers from receiver manufacturers in the audience, I think this work has highlighted how important it is for an application to protect against spoofing, to have the symbols available, not only the bits, but also the symbols. So this is something that from the Commission point of view, we are trying to emphasize, that if there are ways by which manufacturers can make available the symbols before they are decoded with the Viterbi into the bits, that would facilitate a lot the development of applications to make their receivers even more robust. I just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks, Ignacio.
Okay, and there's one final question.
Oh,
It
yes.
says, what is the role of the secondary chip used in E5A?
Okay, well, it's not really relevant to the paper here, but I presume you mean this the secondary code modulation on E5A, which is simply used to aid in acquisition, as far as I know, and synchronization. But that's a little bit outside of the scope of the paper.
Yes, I would understand that also as the secondary code of the pilot component, which is if I understand correctly, it has nothing. I mean, it is not related to this work, because here we are talking about we are focusing on the data components that are providing unpredictable bits through OSNMA, and this is restricted to the INAV E1 B component. And for the moment, this is the only one, because even in the E5B INAV data component, OSNMA is not transmitted at the moment. So this is something to be highlighted, because there was a question on FNAV, now this question on E5A, but even in E5B there is no OSNMA service at the moment, only in E1B, and therefore we are focusing on the E1B component for this analysis.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both so much. We appreciate this presentation, and we thank those of you who have joined us. Again, a recording of this will be posted to our website within 24 hours, and we encourage you to download and read the full paper at navi.ion.org. So, Killian and Ignacio, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.